Hi, Andreas from Toddle here. One of the questions we get asked quite a lot in Toddle is about responsive web design. How do you do responsive web design in Toddle? How do you set breakpoints? And also, why doesn't it work just like it does in Webflow? So we already did a video on responsive design, but I'd like to dig a little bit deeper, both into what are the kind of tools we have in Toddle around responsive design, but also how we think about it and how we recommend you think about responsive design when designing websites. The first thing to note, and the first important thing, is that Toddle doesn't have like a responsive engine or a responsive system or anything like that. It's really just CSS. Like, it's the underlying layouts and tricks that you have in the browser. It's exactly the same thing you use in Toddle. When it comes to like the elements you're on screen and the styling, Toddle is really just a really nice interface for HTML and CSS. Like, we're not reinventing the wheel here. These are really tried and tested technologies, and we're just creating a great way of using them, right? So the answer really to how do you do responsive web design in Toddle is exactly the same as how do you do responsive web design on the web. So I've set up a little project here to sort of showcase how we would go about making this site responsive. So I created this site. It's right now very not responsive, as it literally only works in this size. And we'll sort of go through, and then we'll fix all the problems, and we'll talk about it along the way. So let's just have a look here, right? So the first thing you'll notice, as I'm resizing my screen, we can see that this really nothing has been done yet, right? It really only looks right at the exact right screen width. And this can seem like a little bit of a sort of made up example, and it technically is, but like everything here is stuff I've seen in the wild. So like you can run into this, right? So the first thing we have is that the items here in our container aren't actually aligned center, right? Which we would want them to be. And we can see why that is, because their container here is sort of aligned to the left, and it's not taking up the available space, right? So the first thing we can do here is just say, I want you to have a width of 100%. And this is the first part of responsive web design, right? Whenever possible, whenever it makes sense, use dynamic units. And so percent here is an example of that. Percent means take up, in this case, 100% of the width of the parent. But in this case, it's subtracting the margins, right? So because the parent has some margins here on it, it's kind of 100% of the space the parent allows you to take up in this case, right? And then on the same, we can just kind of adjust these to be center, right? So now, as we're scaling up and down, these cards remain center. The title is all over the place, but we'll deal with that later. So this now works pretty well as I'm scaling up. But as I'm scaling down, we can see that these cards are kind of just staying there, and like they're starting to float outside of the screen. And I think for a lot of people, especially when working in Webflow, especially in working a lot of other visual development tools, I'm immediately going to sort of think that we need to add a breakpoint here, because it's kind of logic. On the desktop view here, the wide view, it works. It doesn't work on smaller screens, so let's go and fix the layout on smaller screens. But in CSS, we actually have quite a lot of tools available. And generally, I recommend letting breakpoints be the last tool you reach for in the toolbox instead of the first. So if there's another way of solving our responsiveness problem, it's almost always better to use that instead of adding a breakpoint. Well, because when you're adding a breakpoint, you're essentially adding a whole new set of styles that override the existing styles on that element. And having more sets of styles makes it harder to easily glance and understand what's going on, right? So the simpler you can have your styling, the less sets of styles you have, the easier it is to manage your project. And of course, you might later come back to this page and start tweaking some things and changing the widths of stuff. And now you sort of have to remember to actually check, oh, did I also update everything correctly on all the different breakpoints? There's more places where you can potentially introduce layout issues if you have multiple breakpoints. So let's have a look at what we can do instead. So in this case, we're using Flexbox for our layout here. So this div, this outer div is what we call the Flexbox container, and these cards inside are Flex children, right? So for the container, we have an option of saying Flex Wrap, and in toddle, it's this little wrap button down here under the gap. And if you choose wrap, what's going to happen is that as we scale down, when there's no longer room, and you can actually see that's when the padding here on the side begins to push in on the size. So when there's no longer room for all 4 cards, they're going to start breaking into a new line. And as we are reducing the width even further, they break down to 4, and then eventually break down to a single column, right? And we can see we keep going down here, right? So we can use wrap, on this case, the layout system, to actually say, this is how I want you to behave as the screen reduces, and we can define one behavior that works at all screen sizes. And whenever that's possible, that's probably what you want. Now, this might not be 100% your idea of how this layout should be, and that's fine. So you might say, for example, but I don't like it wrapping here. I want it to go straight from 4 to 2 by 2, right? That's perfectly fine. Like, part of designing a web app is also designing the responsiveness part of it, right? So there's not one right answer. You get to figure out, what do you think your app should behave like, right? In my case, I kind of like it, so I'm going to keep it around. One thing though is, as we scale down, we start to see we hit our next problem, which is as we get to around those 400, I say a little bit more, but around 400 pixels, we're beginning to have the same problem just with single cards, right? We're sort of eating into the card, and we're not getting these nice borders we want on the side. And that's because our cards are set to be 400 pixels wide, right? And ideally, we want to cover all the way down to something like 375 pixels, which is, I think in this case, what we have for the iPhone mini, right? I think official sort of guidelines say 350 is the smallest, but there's very, very few devices that are 350. So if it works at 375, you can't get it to work at 350. It's my experience that it's generally not a problem. One quick side note is that some of you might wonder why, but this is an iPhone 13 mini. It's got a very high resolution Retina display. It's obviously not just 375 pixels wide. And that's true. But the thing is, actually, pixels doesn't really mean pixels on the web anymore. And this sort of happened as screen resolution started going up. We got these Retina displays that had 4 times the amount of pixels as other displays. And the reality is that if they'd kept pixels to like 1 pixel to mean 1 pixel, every website would have been a tiny little thing in the middle of the screen, right? So pixels doesn't actually mean pixels on the web, and it hasn't for many, many years now. It is kind of just a unit that's really kind of nondescript, to be honest. It's only for legacy reasons called pixels. That has nothing to do with what we're doing here. It's just a little side note if you're wondering why it's set 375 pixels. Anyway, we're going down, and we're seeing we want to get to that 375, and at that point, our layout is kind of breaking. So we need to figure out how to make this card smaller. But we could just go and say, make it like, hey, make it 350, right? And now it fits, and that's fine. It works. But the thing is, I don't really want it to be 350. I want it to take up more space when it's larger, right? And so again, I think we're in one of those cases where a lot of people say, right, that's very clearly the mobile breakpoint, right? Let's change it for the mobile breakpoint. But again, we have more tools up our sleeves. We don't really need to reach for breakpoints left yet. So one option we can use here is we can use max width. So just like you can set the actual width and height of an element, you can also set these constraints with saying, like, so in this case, we want it to be 400 pixels, but we never want it to be larger than 100%. So we're saying be 400 pixels, but if the maximum width, but never exceed 100% of the allotted space from the container, right? And what happens now is as we're sort of scaling down, when we start hitting that limit where we're going below 400, it's going to start resizing itself down and actually stay inside the size it should. So it's 400, but never more than 100%, right? I'm just going to copy this and we're going to add it onto the other ones real quick, right? In a real scenario, I would probably have created components out of these, so I didn't need to go and copy styles between them. That seems a bit unnecessary, but this is a demo, so I did a quick one, right? So here, as we're scrolling down now, when we're going very low, we go into test mode. We can see all these cards are nice and neatly aligned in the center, and they're not like breaking outside of the design, right? One more thing is, because this is called Flexbox, this layout system, and it's called that because it's all about boxes that flex, right, and resize themselves. Let's say on a larger screen, we actually wanted these cards to take up more available space. Like right now, they're always 400 pixels unless they go smaller, right? But because this is Flexbox, we actually have a lot more options to play with here, right? So I can go and say on size, if we open this little extra menu, I can say, oh, go and flex 1. And this basically says, go and take up one part of the available space inside this container. And it's like what's left when you've set the other cards, right, that are not flexing. The reason why it's a number here is you can make it take up more than one part. I'll show you that in a second. For now, we'll just go and add 1 to all these different cards, right? So now when they all have flex 1, they're all taking up equal amounts of space, and we can all scale them up and down here, right? And as we're doing that, let's go here. As we're doing that, they're all resizing themselves to take up the available space, right? And so you can see how this can be used not just for cards, but in any sort of situation where you need a responsive layout, having one or more of the children here, like just go in and grab the available space, right? One thing to note here is that when you do that, when you go into Flexbox and tell it to flex, it basically just ignores its width. So it says, well, okay, that's more of a suggestion, right? Try and be 400 pixels, but actually take up all the space, right? And like get as big as a large or small as you need to be to take up that space, right? So the way to think of it, like, and this is a common mistake that I've made more than many. I've said, like, I set it to 400 pixels. Why is it not 400 pixels? Like, well, if it's inside a flex container and you set it to flex, it's not going to respect that width of 400 pixels, right? One thing to note when we're doing this is that it kind of goes both ways. It can go up real high, but it can also go low real high. And there's nothing here that's really stopping it yet from going down. Eventually it will as we're hitting some minimum width on some of the items inside. But it actually allows us to sort of like size it down until some of this text start overflowing. We obviously don't want that. So one thing we can do, a really nice trick, is we can, just like we set a maximum width on these items, we can also set a minimum. We can set a maximum boundary and a minimum boundary. And one value you can use here is the one called fit-content. And fit content is, and again, all I'm showing, right, is part of CSS. These are not toddle specific things that we came up with at all. This is how CSS and how flexible design of responsive layouts work in the browser, right? So if I set this to fit content, what's going to happen is as I'm scaling it down, it's going to find a point when the content sort of stops fitting because it's about to break out, and it's going to stop resizing down, right? We can see that the other cards here, right, they keep getting smaller, but this one kind of stops because that's the one we set it on. Fit content can be really, really useful, especially in situations where you may not know what the size of the content should be. So because Toddle is a really powerful tool for building super dynamic sites, a lot of times the actual data, the actual text you're showing on a page, is not something that's there when you're designing. It's something that's being fetched from a database. And one user might fetch a string that's slightly longer than another user. So you might not be able to know ahead of time what the size of each thing should be, or how wide it's going to be. So being able to use something like fit content means that your app and your layout can be responsive not just to the screen size, but actually also to the content that you're dynamically fetching. Fit content here, especially for something like minimum value, can be really powerful, because when you're building in Toddle, it's not just the screen size that might change. But since Toddle is really great for building like very dynamic websites and dynamic apps, a lot of the times the actual text content on the site, it's not something you necessarily know ahead of time or while you're designing it. It might be fetched from a database somewhere. It might be something the user just typed in. And so the width of that and the amount of content can shift. And so using something like fit content allows you to build UI that's dynamic and responsive, not just to the screen size, but actually to the content size as well. It does also have some fallbacks. So in this case, if I go and set the same thing on, we can go, here we are. I can go and set the same thing on the card next to it, and you can see as we're scaling down, what's going to happen is that the content on this card is slightly bigger than the content of this card, and now they're different sizes. So in my case, that's not actually what I want. I'm going to go and just change this to be 330 pixels and do the same for this and the other ones, right? Because in my case, I don't actually, like, I know this is static content, right? This is my pricing page. The amount of content is not going to drastically change. So I'm perfectly happy just putting in a number here that says, no, 330 is the minimum width. And so now as we're scaling down, once the cards hit that 330 width, they're going to start, the layout's going to start breaking into new lines. And again, our unicorn plan sort of goes to a new line. I'm actually quite happy with that, because that kind of just means that these three are separate out. And again, the unicorn is kind of separate. So I think that works. And we'll go down into the 4x4 and we keep going down. Now layout works at every single pixel, right? And this is sort of a this sort of point of it working and me resizing this up and down is actually really important to sort of realize, because in the old days we used to just design for desktop sites, and we used to have this 960 grid, which was like the optimal width of a website was 960 pixels, because almost every laptop or desktop had a width of that. So it's pretty safe for desktop, and you would then go and design a whole separate site if you were doing mobile. But then again, most websites just wasn't, right? When the first smartphones came out, first iPhone, it had these zoom features because it knew that none of the website worked on mobile, right? Today, that's kind of different, right? Like we're not designing for a single device screen or trying to have one size that fits all at all anymore. Those days are long gone. We're also not really designing for desktop, tablet, mobile anymore, because the reality is that there are so many mobile devices, so many tablet devices, and so many desktop devices that it's not really three categories at all, right? There are tablets that are bigger than desktops and the other way around. So you really have the smallest devices and the largest devices and almost every single pixel in between. Like there's just, it doesn't really make sense to talk about devices anymore, because there are so many of them and they kind of cover the whole spectrum. So when we talk about responsive design, and where the responsive design comes from, is this idea of having a design that's fluid and adapts to whatever size it's being displayed on, right? So it's not about the desktop layout, the tablet layout, the mobile layout. It's about having a layout that works seamlessly across any screen size. And we have like a lot of devices listed here, so you can still go and check with something. But really the point is that what you want to do here is like just fit everything, right? And so when I'm resizing this, I get to see not just maybe the most popular screen sizes, but everything in between, right? Right. So we fixed the grid. I'm happy with that now. Let's go and take a look at the title, right? And so the first thing we'll notice here is that it has a left offset here of 592 pixels. And this is what we often call a magic number, because why 592, right? That seems like an odd, weird number. The answer is almost certainly that whoever made this had a screen size where when you take the width of the text and add 592 to the left, it looks kind of centered, right? And again, this is a made-up example, but I've absolutely seen this in the wild, right? So we want that to be fixed, because we want that. It's obviously not always going to be 592. We need this to be responsive, right? So I'm going to start by removing that. And so now we have a H1 that's floating to the left. And the first thing I'm going to do here is actually the same thing I did with the grid container. I'm going to change this to be with 100%. So it's taking up all the available space. And now because H1 in this case is not set to flex, but text in this case, text is actually the block display property in CSS, which is really good for rendering, for like doing text layout. Flexbox is not very good for text layout, but it's really good for blocks and like UI elements, right? So you can switch what layout system works best for what you're doing. In this case, we're using text. That means we don't have all these layout options and wrap and everything we do in Flexbox. We have a whole separate bit now. And one of them is we can text align center. And that works very well for us, because that's exactly what we want. Now as we're going down, and I can actually use here in toddle, I can use my hotkeys 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 5 is like 1440p display. Can't remember what 4 is. What 3? Yeah, 4 is 1080, and then we go into what's called laptop, which is like a, I'm not actually sure what size that is. And we can sort of keep going down to a tablet size and a phone size. And again, the point here is not that I want you to go design specifically for these sizes, but as you're viewing them, and especially as you see the animation between them, like you get sort of an idea of like, does this actually work on all the different sizes, right? It's a really good use of the number keys here to quickly sort of zoom around between them, right? Right. So one thing I have is that when we go all the way down to the smaller size we want to support here, I think this title takes up too much space, right? It looks all right, but it's a little bit big. So I would like it to be smaller on mobile devices, or at least small devices, let's say it that way. But once we get to about this size, where it actually starts coming up, I think it looks great, right? So, and again, we're kind of back to, I want it to be smaller on smaller sizes. Again, it sounds exactly like, let's do a breakpoint, right? But we're still going to hold off that for a little bit, right? So one thing we can do here with H1s, or any text element, is we can, instead of defining it in rem, so if you're not familiar with rem is a unit that's essentially a multiple of the default text size in the browser. What does that mean? That means that for my browser, I've got it set for normal settings. That means by default, the font size is 16 pixels. But let's say someone might be a little bit older or have a little bit harder seeing. They might set the font size to 18 or 20 pixels, just to make sure everything is a little bit more readable, right? We want it just a little bit bigger so it's a little bit easier to see. And they can go and change that. And if you use rem as a unit for setting font size, you'll find that like everything just adjusts, right? You'll just have like the 4 rem is 4 times as big as the basic thing, basic size, right? So everything still works. So rem is really good, and actually the recommended unit to use for text, which we're not going to do right now, but I'll show you why. So we have a responsive unit here called Viewport width, and it's denoted VW. And we're going to set it to 10. And that means I want the font size here to be 10% of the width of the viewport. And the viewport here is the part in here right here where we can see our app, right? That's the viewport. And what that does is that as I'm resizing my window, the font size is going to adopt that, and it's going to match sort of my like a fixed percentage here, if you will, of the width. And again, this is another dynamic unit, just like percent. Percent for text works differently. It's percent of the current set font size. So it's not going to be percent of the width when you're setting it for font size. So that's why we are using viewport width here. There's also viewport height, and there's actually a bunch of other viewport units. You can look them up. Anything that you can use in CSS, you can use in Toddle, right? So when we're setting this viewport width, like, we get this nice effect of it scaling up and down, which I think works really well, and I quite like it. It breaks into two. I think that works. The one thing maybe that I'm not sure works is that when we get up to the larger sizes here, actually, okay, now maybe it's a bit aggressive, right? So I want to find a point where we're saying, okay, maybe when we're, let's say maybe it'll go around 700. Should we do that? Maybe when we're around 700, we'll do a little bit before here. 600, right? About 600 pixels. I want this to just use the static rem again, right? Like, I don't want from here to keep scaling up. Only do it for smaller sizes, right? And so we finally got there. We're gonna use a media query to say actually only set the font size to rems once you're above, in this case, I think we ended up being, what is it good? Yeah, 600 pixels, right? We'll do it around here. So how do you add breakpoints in Toddle? You do it up here in our little style selector. So in Toddle, you're adding these style rules. These are all the default rules we set, but we can add a new style rule with the plus button. And you can do things like saying this should only be applied when you hover, or when, for example, a button is disabled. But in our case, we want to use this viewport width. And when I'm selecting that, it's automatically going to put in my current width, which is 604.7. There's absolutely no reason why the 4.7 matters. We're not that accurate. But again, it doesn't really matter, because we're just going roughly that. So I'm just going to accept that. And you can see now this says above 604.7 pixels wide. What we want to do there is we're going to set the font size to 4 rems, right? And we can see it jumps a little bit. Like, it's not a perfect match, but it doesn't need to be, right? Now, as we start resizing our window, we can see that we're hitting that 4 rem for the large screen sizes. And as we're scaling down, we're getting closer and closer. It's going to start to break into 2 lines, and then it's going to start scaling down here from 600, around 600 pixels all the way down. And it'll keep looking good all the way down on mobile devices, right? And if we go into test mode, we can see our whole page actually works really well on mobile. Great. That was what I wanted to talk about today. There's obviously a lot more than this to responsive web design. It's things that being taught massive courses on. So I'm not going to cover everything today, but I thought I'd cover some of the basic stuff and basic things that we use every day, and really sort of impose this idea of try to start with dynamic units, start with the flexbox layout, all the power that comes with that, and then only reach for breakpoints when you actually really need them. And they are really powerful and flexible. There's a lot of times when that's the right tool, but I think it's easy to jump and try and use breakpoints a little bit too early. Now, I promised I also would explain why Toddle, it works different than Webflow. So if you used Webflow, you might know that in Webflow, as you're resizing the screen to different sizes, right? If I'm on mobile view, it's only going to apply styles to the mobile breakpoint. Whenever I'm at this size and I'm out here on my style panel adding these styles, it's only going to apply them to a mobile breakpoint. The same when I'm on the tablet and desktop, etc. There's some point where I think at certain screen size, it applies at every size, right? But you don't have to sort of go and create this. I don't need to go and create a breakpoint here by clicking a button, because as soon as I'm on this size screen, it's going to do that automatically, right? So the reason why we don't have that is because we fundamentally have a different approach. As I've said a few times now, we think breakpoints should be the last tool in your toolbox. And if it's the last tool in your toolbox, this really gets in the way, right? Because throughout this whole video, I've been dragging this window back and forth again and again and again to verify that the design I'm building and the layout I'm making here works at every single size, right? And I only just realized at this point here, for example, maybe 1400 pixels, that's when I realized that I needed to address the flexpot layout and make it wrap. And it was only at 300 and just below 400 pixels, I realized that we needed a max width on these elements, right? And the same thing realizing around here 600 pixels when I realized that this title actually needs to start scaling down because it didn't really work anymore, right? And so I only discovered that because the screen was that size, but I still don't want to apply all these things to a breakpoint. I want to apply all these styles as the default, because that way, whenever I select this element and glance on the right, I can see all the styles that apply to it. I don't need to go and dig through breakpoints or resize my window to figure out what's going on. I get a really quick overview. And the only price I'm paying is that when I actually do need a breakpoint, I just need an extra click for it, right? So we think it's a much better to be explicit about that, especially when you're flipping it on its head and saying we shouldn't just always reach for breakpoints no matter what we're doing, right? Let's go and always pick the best tool for the job we're currently solving. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this video was helpful. I hope this sort of helped, especially newcomers coming to Toddle, understand why it can be a little bit different, why we made some of the choices we did. And yeah, go try out Toddle if you haven't yet. Go build some beautiful responsive websites. Make sure to share it with us in the Discord when you've done so. We love seeing what people build. Thank you very much.